You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. Between 2 and 6% of people have hoarding disorder, yet very few of us talk about it. Learn about the condition from me, somebody who has it, as well as academics, therapists, and other experts I interview. Find out how to support the podcast at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Finally, I am not a doctor, I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. Hey, how are you? I am okay. I feel like I haven't done a solo episode for ages, although that's not true. But hello, very glad you're here. Today I am talking about 11 things that I have learned since starting this podcast that I wouldn't necessarily have expected. I think when I started the podcast, I expected to learn to fix this thing. I expected maybe to learn a bit more about hoarding disorder, and I certainly have learned a lot more about hoarding disorder. But there's other things that I've learned more indirectly that prove valuable to me when trying to tackle my hoarding. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. And then I shout out another podcast that has a valuable little tidbit of thought-provoking information.
Let's start with some housekeeping.
The February Dehoarding Darlings update is live, so if you are a dehoarding darling, head over there to read it. And the Dehoarding Accountability Zoom sessions are still ongoing. It would be lovely to see you there. If you would like to come, please do give it a try. Or if you've been before, come back. Always nice to see new and familiar faces, or not faces. If you don't want to have your face on the screen, that's completely fine. For either of those things, to find out more, head to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/links, LINKS, not links the big cat. So, 11 unexpected things this podcast has taught me about mistakes, about life, about perfectionism, about progress. I've learned a lot about the psychology of hoarding. I've learned a lot about research. I've learned a lot about different aspects that can be connected to hoarding, like overspending or ADHD or all of these things. But that's not what I'm talking about today. What I'm talking about today is the more indirect things. So the first one is that showing progress rather than perfection is helpful, even if it makes me cringe. So what I'm talking about there is the early episodes. I hate them. They are me in a state of misery and despair and desperation and feeling completely powerless. I also hate them because they are terrible quality. I had no idea what I was doing. And I also hate them because often if I get a less than glowing review, it's based on those early episodes rather than the last 150. So I sometimes think about taking those episodes down. I certainly, if anybody asks me where to start these days, I always say not at the beginning. I don't think they represent what I do now, but what they do represent is progression. They are still live in the feed, even though I hate them, because they demonstrate progression. They demonstrate improvement in every sense. Improvement in my understanding of this thing, improvement in my sense that maybe I can do something about it, improvement in how to make a podcast. And I'm the kind of person who is much more comfortable coming into a situation saying, I solved a thing, here's how I did it. As well as being incredibly vulnerable in just talking about this incredibly difficult subject, something else that makes me feel incredibly vulnerable about this podcast is that it's essentially a record of progress and learning. And it's a record of mistakes, and it's a record of backtracking, and it's a record of slowly sometimes getting the hang of things. And that's hard for me. But also, it's how life works. It's important to me, even if it's harder, to not come in having solved this. And but to be absolutely clear, I have not solved this. However, what I have found is 100 different things that help a bit, each of which I try and apply on a gradual, continual, overall basis. And I can't say to you, you'll make mistakes, you will do some things that are brilliant and some things that are less brilliant, and that all of that is okay and fine if I hide the evidence of me at my lowest and most desperate and least capable in terms of making a podcast. So that's why the first thing this podcast has taught me is that showing progress rather than perfection is helpful, even if it makes me cringe. The second thing this podcast has taught me is to examine my own contradictions. Someone asked me recently if I edit out ums and ahs and pauses and that kind of thing. And what I said was that I edit some ums and ahs and pauses and mistakes out, but I also leave some in because I am having a normal conversation with a normal person, and sometimes we and ah and make mistakes. And I don't want this to sound like some kind of robotic thing. I'm not a fan of podcasts where every pause and every imperfection has been removed. And what I said to the person who asked me was, I try and tidy it up without perfecting it, basically. And I realised that highlights a big contradiction in me, because I try and tidy up dialogue and audio in the podcast without perfecting it. And I think that's the best way forward, but I'm not applying that to my own home all the time. In my own home, I try and perfect things and invariably fail, and that feels miserable. I don't know whether it's because I used the word tidy in my answer, but it suddenly really stood out to me that I try and tidy it up without perfecting it, basically. Could and maybe should also be my approach to sorting out my stuff. The third unexpected thing this podcast has taught me is that I can do things I didn't think I could. Some of it is really technical. If I'm interviewing someone and we accidentally talk over each other, I can mute one of the tracks without muting them both. I didn't think I could do that, and I can. I didn't think I could bring an episode out weekly for years, and I can, and I do. I didn't think I could organise accountability sessions that people come to and really value and that I benefit from as well. And yet I do. And all of that has come from incremental steps and incremental improvements and incremental change. Things that felt impossible become possible, not with a big dramatic flash of light, but with moving one little step closer towards it repeatedly. And learning that I can do things I didn't think I could in terms of the podcast, that expands a bit into life. And I realise that maybe I can do things I didn't think I could in my home. Maybe I can at work. Maybe I can socially. And that's a really valuable thing to have learned, even if when I started out, that wasn't at all on my hopes and fears for this thing. My hopes for this thing was somewhere I could talk about the thing I couldn't talk about anywhere else in life. And look what it's become. It blows my mind every time I think about it. The fourth thing this podcast has taught me is that I can go outside of my comfort zone and it can work. I'm not anti-comfort zone. I think we deserve comfort. And I'm also not the kind of person who advocates flinging yourself way out of your comfort zone. Although that's based on my own personality and my own sense of what I can and can't do. Some people thrive on flinging themselves out of their comfort zone, and good for them. I guess that's why people climb Everest or go to the moon. But that's not me. I appreciate my comfort zone, but I've also come to appreciate that nudging the edges of it just to widen it a tiny, tiny bit at a time is incredibly valuable, and I end up doing things I would never have thought were possible. The first time I interviewed somebody on this podcast, I was terrified. I'm always a bit nervous when I interview a new person. And there are rewards from expanding your comfort zone a bit. And some of them are expected. Some of them are you can anticipate. Like, I'm nervous about going to the new place, but I want to see my friends that I've arranged to meet there. And you can kind of think, if I make myself do this, I will probably have a great evening with my friends. And that can be an expected reward for pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. But there can be really unexpected ones as well. And there've been a lot of those with the podcast, often around how I feel about myself or how I treat myself or things I've learned. Often, if I approach somebody to be a guest on the podcast and they are not strictly a hoarding specialist, so they're not maybe a therapist like Jan who treats people who hoard, they are not a researcher who works on hoarding. If it's somebody a bit outside of those, the bit outside the box, that feels more vulnerable because I don't know what they think about hoarding in general. This doesn't often happen. Nearly everybody I interview has some kind of specialist knowledge or experience around hoarding, but there's the odd time when I know that somebody would be perfect and they are not a specialist in hoarding. I'm thinking, for instance, of episode 161 with Steve Chapman, who's an artist, and he did some really creative work around his inner critic. And I was really moved by his TED Talk, which is what got me to approach him. But that was a nervous one because it was definitely outside my comfort zone. As it was, Steve was immediately on board with the idea and was very thoughtful and respectful, and it worked out brilliantly. And it was a fascinating episode to research and record, and I know I've heard from you that you got a lot from it. And of course, stepping out of your comfort zone carries risks. Of course it does. That's why we have a comfort zone. And being afraid of it going wrong can stop us from doing so many things that could have gone right. And sometimes it's worth thinking about balancing that risk, and maybe sometimes it is worth taking a risk, even if it's a risk, even though it's a risk, because the potential outcome could be something absolutely brilliant. The fifth thing that this podcast has taught me is that you can start off knowing less than nothing about something, and you can then learn and learn and learn. I started this podcast in a dark place. I knew the word hoarding, I knew a little bit about it. I'd read a couple of books, but like 10 years earlier. But what I didn't know was how to get myself out of the hole I was in. And there was something about initially just talking into my phone. And as I've said, the first few episodes were predominantly despair. And then having to come up with a new subject each week, a new topic each week, a new interview each week, made me start having to learn more. And if I learned something for the podcast, because the podcast is something that is so personal to me, to my situation, I also learnt it for myself. So if I was learning about a technique that might help you, it might also help me. And often it did. Often it still does. Not always, just like not every tip you hear will help you, but some of them will. I've read more academic papers on hoarding than I ever read about the subject of my degree. Apologies to my former lecturers on that. I've learned not only all of the things I've learned, I've also learnt to spot areas where more needs to be learnt. I've learnt to have conversations with academics. I've learnt to get the best from interviewees. I've learnt to reach out to people. I've learnt the language to talk about hoarding. That was something I was really missing in the early days. I would know there was an issue I faced, but I didn't know how to describe it. I didn't know what it was called. I just knew I found it hard. And all of that has come from talking about it with you and from week after week after week since 2021, needing to make something for you and for me so that on a Friday you know that there will be something from me. And even the bits that I've learnt that aren't relevant to me, like when I talked about animal hoarding, like when I've talked about children of hoarders, or parenting when you hoard, or having a partner who hoards. Even when I've talked about those topics that don't apply to me, I feel like I've gained compassion, I've gained knowledge, I've gained insight. And even when it's a topic that doesn't directly apply to me, there are still often bits I can glean that do feel relevant. And all of that helps me to formulate a new strategy I can try, a new idea that might apply, a new way of understanding myself. So that's the fifth one, that you can start off knowing less than nothing about something and learn and learn and learn. De-hoarding darlings are podcast listeners who get access to extra from me. I write a bonus post every month with a bit of an update from me, additional links, answers to extra questions from guests, some recommendations, and a de-hoarding playlist. You can become a de-hoarding darling and help to support the podcast, as well as getting this bonus monthly post at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/darling. The sixth thing I've learned, thanks to this podcast, is that I can stick to a routine. I've had a love-hate relationship with routines for a long time. I still have. My first few episodes were weekly, and then there was a long gap, but then for years now, there's been a weekly podcast. Every Friday, there's a new episode, and so not only do I have to have something go live on a Friday, that takes planning. I have to research something. I have to record something. I have to edit the audio. I have to transcribe the episode. I have to get it up on the website and the podcast hosting. If it's an interview, I have to find the right person to interview. I have to approach them. We have to come up with a time. I have to research and plan the episode. And then we record it and then again, edit, transcribe, all of that. And there can be a lot of juggling of balls for sure, but every Friday there's an episode. And I would not have anticipated that 4 years after starting the podcast, this would be where I would be. And yet it's part of my week. It's part of my routine. I've created a routine that I stick to. And some of that is down to accountability. I know that other people expect a new episode to be there. I know that if I've interviewed somebody, I have a responsibility to them to turn it into the episode. So the accountability definitely helps. And so does me just wanting to do this thing that I seem to have committed to. So I can stick to a routine. I don't want my entire life to be routines, but I can have routines within my life that work, which is more of a surprise to me than anybody else. The seventh thing I have learnt from this podcast that affects the way I deal with my hoarding and my life is that I can learn and change and learn and change and adapt and tweak as I go. The early episodes compared to new episodes are unrecognisable. I've added segments. I have removed segments. I for some reason, spent a long time determined to begin every episode with the word so. I don't do that anymore. I can see what's working and what's not and change accordingly. I can add more, I can take away. I can listen to feedback and decide whether that's something I want to implement. Some feedback has led to great changes in the podcast. Other feedback is unnecessarily personal or tells me to change kind of core things about myself, and I can make a decision to put that to one side and not feel obliged to change myself to please an anonymous person. But this flexibility and adaptability is not something I have traditionally been great at. You will be stunned to hear. And it's been kind of mirrored in tackling my hoarding, where I used to get very stuck on working out the perfect and precise way to fix this. And I would try it and it wouldn't work. And I would go back to the drawing board and go, right, I need a new perfect and precise way to fix this. And everything would stop until I'd worked it out. And then it wouldn't quite work. And so I would scrap it all and start again. And through doing the podcast and what I have learned through that, I have also been able to apply that to my stuff, that I can try a new idea. And if it kind of helps but isn't quite right, rather than scrapping the whole thing, I can tweak. I can do a little bit differently. I can say, well, this bit's mostly working. It's that bit that doesn't seem to be. What can I do about that bit while keeping the main thing I was doing going? I can also deal with the knowledge that something might work for me for a while and then just become less effective. And that used to be devastating, and it used to stop me trying anything, because I would think, even if it works, it's only going to work for 6 weeks or 6 months or however long, and then I'll be back to square one. But it's not true. It might only work for 6 weeks or 6 months, but two things have happened in that time. One is I have learnt an immense amount about myself and what helps and what doesn't. And two is I've made progress in that time. I've made progress with the technique that worked. And that's invaluable knowledge to have about myself. It's honestly been a game changer. The 8th thing I've learned is that accountability helps. Now, I mentioned this in terms of it helping me stick to the routine of I feel accountable to you to get an episode out every week. But it goes deeper than that. I feel responsible for getting out episodes that are as good as I can manage. And that is within time constraints. I work full time. This is something I do extra to that. It is also based on the knowledge I have at the time. You know, maybe I'll learn something new that contradicts something I say today. But I'm doing my best today to do the best I can with the knowledge I have today. And I feel a responsibility to do my best for you while not making myself ill, while not adding pressure to an already very pressurized life at times. But feeling that accountability to you helps to motivate me to keep going and to keep going with making the best thing I can every single week. Speaking to the best people I can every single week. Giving you my best ideas every single week. And that accountability extends obviously to the accountability Zoom sessions, where there is such mutual support and there is such wise wisdom in those groups from people often who don't believe they have wisdom to offer, but then share something they've tried or they've learnt that helps somebody else immeasurably. And so by extension, not only does accountability help, but community helps. Whether that is getting a lovely email from one of you telling me how much a particular episode meant to me, whether it is feeling proud and full of imposter syndrome every time somebody donates, whether it is seeing you as listeners talk to other listeners in the comments of my social media posts, all of that community and accountability is invaluable, and it helps me. It helps me keep the podcast going, and it also helps me keep moving forward with my stuff in my home. The 9th thing I've learned, and this is linked to the first one, but it's not quite the same, is that if people see me making mistakes, or hear me making mistakes, I guess, or not being brilliant at something, it's more or less fine. Occasional negative reviews aside. But the thing that I felt very self-conscious of, which is the vulnerability of making this podcast, is actually the thing that a lot of you appreciate the most. What I would call, in the early days, me being rubbish, or me being needy, or me being a failure, is something that you hear as authenticity and realness. And they are very different takes on the same thing. And when I hear from enough of you, your side of that, it does make me challenge whether I'm giving myself too much of a hard time. And it's true that I am far from perfect. It is true that I have not nailed this. I understand hoarding disorder and hoarding behaviours better than I ever could have dreamed I would. But the practical side of fixing my home is a lot and is something I'm still working on. And the fact that you see that as me being vulnerable and authentic, whereas I see it as me failing, challenges whether I'm really failing for me. And that makes me feel less of a terrible person. I told a second friend about the hoarding only last week, and what I thought she would take from it was that I was disgusting, and what she took from it was that I was really courageous. And sometimes our view of ourselves can be so vastly different to other people's views of us. And making this podcast has been an ongoing series of bits of evidence of that. And some of that makes me warm and fuzzy inside, because maybe you're right, or maybe somewhere in the middle is right, but that's still better than what I think of myself a lot of the time. The 10th thing I have learned since starting this podcast is that guests and listeners treat me with incredible respect, even when I couldn't treat myself with any respect. The first interview I ever did on the podcast was with a woman who grew up as a child in a hoard. And if anybody could be justified in thinking negatively of me, that could be her. Because I could represent the thing that was so incredibly harmful to her in her childhood. And that woman treated me with such respect and such kindness, and it was a respectful and beautiful conversation. And then I would interview somebody else, maybe a therapist, like maybe Jan, maybe Laura Silverstein, maybe a researcher like Sharon Moraine or Jennifer Kraft, and each time I would think, they're going to look at me like I'm disgusting. They are. I know that. And then they wouldn't. They didn't. They looked at me like an equal human. And that's been one of the things that has honestly shifted the needle for me a bit about my own shame. Only a bit. Like, I'm still paralysed by shame. But if interviewee after interviewee after interviewee after interviewee treats me as if I am not a horrifying and disgusting person, if they treat me with respect and are sometimes very impressed by me, maybe I could treat myself with a bit more respect. Maybe my own view of myself, especially in relation to hoarding, could just improve a notch. If they can treat me with compassion, maybe I can treat myself with a bit of compassion as well. And even saying that is so hard because I'm still thinking you'll be thinking, she doesn't deserve to treat herself with compassion. Why does she think that? But maybe I've got to be generous and think that you're not thinking that, because everybody so far has treated me with such respect, and they can't all be wrong. And the 11th and final thing that I have learnt from doing this podcast is that when I learn something in one area of my life, it can apply to others too. The big one of that comes to mind is that idea of being able to work things out as I go along. When I started this podcast, I didn't have any grand plans. I had two thoughts in my mind. One was I needed somewhere to talk about this where nobody knew who I was. And two was I really wanted there to be a podcast by somebody who hoarded. That was all I had in mind. But I've been working it out as I go along. And when I'm tackling some stuff in my home, I'm also learning to work some of it out as I go along. I'm now able to start something not knowing how I'll finish it, or not knowing what the step 3 will be after I've done steps 1 and 2. I'm learning to be able to do step 1 anyway, even if I'm not quite sure what will be next. And losing some of that rigidity has expanded in so many areas of my life. The one I've mentioned before is with cooking. I'm able to start cooking with foods that previously I would never have cooked with because I didn't know precisely how it worked. And I'm learning to be able to go, I'll work it out. And nearly always I work it out. It helped me leave my job last year when that was not working out for me anymore. And I didn't exactly know what would be next. I had an idea, but I didn't know if it would work. I knew what would be next. I didn't know if I could make it work. And so far, I've made it work. Other things that I've learned in one area of my life around the podcast that has applied to other areas in the end too are all the things I've talked about today. That if people see your vulnerable moments, they can appreciate the authenticity rather than judge you for them. I've learned that if someone sees me getting something wrong, that's not the end of the world. I've learned that much as I'm constantly an I'll fix it myself person, that sometimes community is invaluable. I've learned that I can learn and change and adapt. And all of those things, for some of you, will sound really basic. Maybe you always knew how to learn and change and adapt, but I didn't. And the podcast has been instrumental in getting me there. And I hear from you that the podcast has helped you to make changes. And I cannot tell you how much I value every message I get, because when making the podcast is hard, when I'm tired, when I'm in pain, when I've not got time, when I think surely I've said everything there is to say, that's always when an email from one of you pings and it's just perfect. And so much as the imposter syndrome is constantly screaming in my ear, I have to trust to some degree that what I'm doing is helpful to you. I know it's helpful to me, and I have to trust that it's helpful to me as well. And I know it is, in more ways than just learning more stuff, although that's incredible. I think what I'm saying with this episode is that growing and learning in any area of our life can benefit other areas of our lives. For me, a lot of that has been around this podcast. It takes up a lot of my life, this podcast, and I don't resent that, but it's a significant chunk of my life. But the benefits ripple out in all kinds of areas. But there are other things we can do that can teach us about hoarding without teaching us about hoarding, can teach us about coping without teaching us about coping. Maybe you start going to a ballet dancing class and you learn that you're stronger than you think you are, or you learn that you can walk into a new situation and be brave when you feel vulnerable. Maybe you start going to Spanish language classes and you learn that your brain can appreciate sounds you're not familiar with, or you learn that you have a surprising amount of space in your brain for vocabulary. Maybe you start going for a little walk every day and you learn that as well as getting your heart rate up and getting you a bit fitter, you actually start getting fascinated by identifying the birdsong around you. We don't have to think that we only benefit from doing things that directly feel relevant to whatever we're trying to fix. There are transferable skills in everything, and there are transferable learnings in everything. And the more we grow as people, the better we can become.
It's the bit where that hoarder shouts out someone wise.
So shout out to a podcast called Healthy Rich. Have a listen to what she says about marketing.
Businesses are always trying to sell us something, and they'll tell us lies to do it. So they tell us lies about who we are and who we should be. They tell us what's wrong with us and what we can buy to fix it. They tell us what's missing in our lives, and it's conveniently always something that we can buy from them. So we've understandably tried to build up a defense against this consumer culture. That's a good instinct. We should resist those messages that say that we're not good enough and that we should be something different. We shouldn't buy into the messages that see our suffering and convince us that some corporation has the solution just behind a paywall or a price tag.
So I will link to the Healthy Rich podcast in the show notes. It's not one I've listened to a lot. I think that was the first episode I ever listened to. But I'm going to listen to more. I like her take on things. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast. There is the February episode is that it's a progress, that it's a record. I still judge myself so much for this predicament. No.